Darkcast Network. Out of the shadows come the best indie podcasts.
First came love, then came lies, control, and murder. I'm Kai, host of Love and Murder, Heartbreak to Homicide, the true crime podcast where I tell real stories of relationships that were doomed bonds from the start. Reacting with raw honesty, passionate rants, and unfiltered frustration when justice isn't served. I give you new full episodes every Monday with mini cases every Wednesday and Friday. Go to murderandlove.com, that's love and murder backwards, murderandlove.com, where you'll uncover the twisted side of relationships that led to homicide.
Hey everyone, welcome to True Crime California. I'm your host Cindy, and I'm glad you're here. Hey guys, welcome back to True Crime California. The plight of the indie podcaster is never having a mic that is worth a shit, and that's where we're at right now. So if this sounds bad, I'm doing the best I can. I'm basically having to make out with this thing to get it to not sound like I'm in a hallway, which is interesting because it's the same mic and the same program I've always used, and suddenly today this is how it sounds. So let's hope we can get this sounding better. Maybe the next time I record it will be different. Who can say? How's that for an intro, everybody? Welcome back to the show. I'm so happy to be here, and thank you all for being here with me. It's my birthday tomorrow, and I decided that for my second case of January, I was going to do something that I actually find really interesting. Now, as many of you have probably noticed, I've done a couple old school cases, I guess, but mostly I stick to 1970s and earlier. This is definitely an old school case, but in my mind, it's sort of a special circumstance because it is it's a location, where the murders happened is actually somewhere that I work fairly regularly for catering because it is now a wedding venue, which is super ironic. As usual, I'm just kind of starting with a stream of consciousness and all will come to light soon. So what I am talking about is Greystone Mansion. That's the case I'm going to cover today. And this is sort of a history lesson about LA, early US politics, and then of course murder. So if you're into any of those things, or all of them as I am, you're probably going to enjoy this. Before I get started, I just want to address a few things. First of all, somebody gave me a bad review because I swear too much, to which I say I've spoken this way since I was 10 years old, which is kind of insane. And I'm 43 tomorrow, so it's not going to change. If you don't like it, don't listen. But going around leaving negative reviews on indie podcasts is very shitty energy. The type of people who actually take their time to tear down small independent podcasters or small independent businesses, unless they're doing something super egregious, get a fucking life, okay? That's ridiculous. Second, here's something that'll probably get me more bad reviews. Fuck ICE. Fuck this fucking fascist dictatorship bullshit country that we live in. I want to tear all my hair out. Just straight up, this is the worst situation, and fuck it. I've always been a radical leftist, which basically just means I care about people, which is an insane, apparently, thing to feel in this day and age. But I hope you all join me in caring about others and in caring about our world and in standing up to fascism, even though it is extremely dangerous and very, very scary to do so right now. Anyway, okay, let's get into the case. All right, on to the case. But I do want to call out that the politics of this case are definitely not something that happened in a vacuum. And I would wager that the way that this was handled and the way that this kind of went down is very telling for how our future unfolded. When you hear this case and how everything kind of ended, you're oh yeah, that makes sense for where the fuck we're at right now. Anyway, so like I said, this is the case of the Greystone Mansion. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Greystone Mansion is a huge Tudor style mansion built in the late 1920s in what is now Beverly Hills. Tudor basically means castle-like. So a lot of stone, very old school, sort of a precursor to Gothic style. So there's a lot of pointy stuff going on, pointed rooftops, almost a jagged, very masculine look to it. I could get more specific, but I think we're all on the same page. Giant stone castle style house, right? The house itself is 46,000 square feet. And at the time it was built, it was the second largest house, I guess you're going to call it, in California. It was second only, of course, to Hearst Castle up in San Simeon near San Luis Obispo, which was built by the publishing tycoon and all-around horrible person, William Randolph Hearst. Now, Greystone sat on over 400 acres, which if you know anything about LA, and like especially that area, you know that's an insane amount of land to have, as the entire area at this point is completely developed. So this was like way back in the 20s, nothing was developed. There was just open land, and the owners of this home were just buying it up left, right, and center. At the time, the family who built this mansion were one of the richest families in the world, and it was none other than the Doheny family, which was, like I said, one of the richest and most powerful families. I said in the country, but I think it was actually in the world. The patriarch of the family, Edward L. Doheny, was an oil tycoon who was actually the first person to drill for oil in Los Angeles, which set off the oil boom in the late 1980s and early 1900s. Now, he also drilled in Mexico and Venezuela, if that's ringing any bells currently, and eventually founded the Pan American Petroleum and Transport Company in 1916. This company later became one of the largest oil companies in the world in the 1920s, with Edward cashing in on World War I's need for petroleum for the war, which also plays into later on because during World War I, private interests had all of the oil and they were selling it to the government at a premium price. And let's just say, this is why it's important to know your history, because when you look at things like Venezuela and what's going on there, and sort of just our country as a whole, when you hear about the way things came to be from the past, it really helps inform you as to how evil shit has been forever and why we're fucked now. Anyway, let's get back to it. So Edward actually came from modest beginnings, with his family not having really any connections, and this is a real story of a person who made their money from nothing. Now, that being said, he did so through various unscrupulous means, to be sure. And that's actually at the center of this whole thing. You don't drill for oil in Mexico as an American without pulling some strings, greasing some palms, etc. Edward married once, but his first wife committed suicide after they divorced in 1899. We'll talk about that a little bit more, too. This was after the couple had 2 children, a daughter who was born very sickly and died of heart-related issues at only 7 years old, and a son, Edward Jr., who went by Ned and was born in 1983. Now, those of us who are familiar with LA, we all know the Doheny name well. There's Doheny Drive, which is home to many very expensive mansions. There's Doheny State Beach, which is popular among locals in Malibu. USC has a Doheny Memorial Library. And then there's also the Doheny Mansion, which was the family mansion while Ned was growing up. The family bought the mansion in 1900 from another rich but ultimately insignificant family in terms of political sway or whatever. And this purchase was signaling of a new era for the Doheny family. Edward had struggled for many years prior to striking it rich in oil, and this purchase was a sign that things were only going to get better. Or at least that they should, or at least monetarily. After purchasing the home in 1900, the family kept buying the land around it until it stretched, as I'd said, to over 400 acres, which is an insane amount of land anywhere, but especially in LA. As Ned grew up, he helped his father in the business, and when he married his bride Lucy in 1914, the couple moved into a home they had bought with Ned's money. Now, funny enough, this was the same year that Edward bought the land Greystone would later be built on, which makes this story seem almost inevitable. The couple then went on to have 5 children by the mid-1920s, and their growing family was in need of more space, apparently to the tune of 46,000 square feet. Now, Edward Doheny Sr., rich beyond imagination, was happy to gift this mansion to his son. He had actually had it built as part of a design competition, and I don't know that he had plans for it beyond having it built, so it worked out very well that his son wanted to move in, and in fact, Ned and his friend, who we'll talk about soon, did a lot of the planning on this house, knowing that Ned would eventually move in. And now, when I say that he gifted it to him, I mean that Ed Sr. sold it to Ned for $10, and this included the 400 acres on which it sat. So talk about nepotism, right? But, as we'll see, this nepotism comes at a very high price. Now, as I previously mentioned, Ned grew up working for his father, and one thing his father insisted all Doheny men do, starting with Ned but continuing on with Ned's children, was to work with their hands at least for a short time so they would know the value of hard work. Which is actually pretty cool considering how spoiled the children of rich people tend to be. And it's not to say that Ned was not deeply spoiled, obviously, but this was one thing that Edward got right, in my opinion. Ned's birth had nearly coincided with the birth of the automobile. I mean, not really, but like its popularity. And as he grew, so did the public's interest in personal transportation. Ned himself was a huge car enthusiast, so naturally he chose to work in an auto shop to fulfill his father's wishes. Now, it didn't hurt that Ned's high school sweetheart, Lucy, was the daughter of a man who owned many auto repair shops, which made it even easier for Ned to get a, quote, job in this field that it already likely would have been really easy for him, but like this made it even easier. Ned was maybe 20 when he started hanging around the auto shop, and there he met Hugh Plunkett, who worked for his soon-to-be bride's father. The two men hit it off, and Hugh became Ned's personal mechanic, chauffeur, and later his right-hand man with the official title of secretary. The two even served in the Navy together, with Ned promising Hugh a job upon their safe return, and of course, making good on his promise. Now, Hugh had always been a blue-collar guy, working as a mechanic before working for the Doheny family, and he was a very salt-of-the-earth person, despite his connection to this very wealthy family. He was one of the only outsiders to be let in on any family secrets, which were plentiful. As you know, all rich families have secrets. All families have secrets, but rich people probably have juicier ones. So this is interesting, as Hugh isn't from money, but is still seen as a trusted member of their inner circle. Though, as we'll see, he's definitely not seen as family, to be sure. There is absolutely a line there, and we'll see that. Hugh was married at one point, but ended up spending so much time at the Doheny estate, mainly in the motor pool or in one of their guest rooms, that his wife finally divorced him, citing desertion as her reason for the divorce, and it was granted. So that's how often he was away from home, which is crazy. Now, when I first started writing this, I made the assertion, my next sentence was, Hugh, it seemed, was becoming addicted to a lifestyle that had been previously far out of his reach. And as he became more entwined in the lives of the Dohenys, his personal life continued to fall apart. But what I want to say here is, as the case developed and as I learned more about the case, because I knew it and I had some obviously preconceived notions, I want to backtrack that statement. I want to make it because I do think that his life became very entwined with the Dohenys, obviously, but I don't think that it was the money that kept him there. And again, we'll get more into it, but just hold that in your back pocket. The Greystone Mansion was finished in 1928, and the family moved into the 55-room home in October of that same year. And with them came Hugh, though not officially, of course. However, he immediately laid claim to a particular guest room, which became his office and bedroom whenever he stayed at the house, which again, was very often. Now, around this time, things weren't going super great for the Doheny family. Ed Sr., who, as I mentioned, built his fortune from nothing, I also mentioned, did so through various unscrupulous means. As with today, you don't become a billionaire, which he was like that day's version of, through honest work. He was like a multi-millionaire. As you can imagine, being very rich and powerful meant that Ned was also very well connected politically. Enter one of the lesser remembered but still very significant scandals in American history, that of the Teapot Dome. Before Watergate, this was a Watergate-level scandal. And if you don't know what Watergate is, look it up, or just listen to this and know they're about on the same level. Now, Teapot Dome referred to an area in Wyoming that was oil-rich, to say the least. Further, there was another area next to the dome that had even more oil, to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars worth, even back in 1915. Now, at first, this oil was kept for the U.S. military to help keep their oil supply steady and to avoid private businesses price gouging, because that's how Ed had made his money round one. So basically to set up the military to not have to pay private prices for oil. This was put into place by President Taft in 1909, but by the time President Harding took office in 1921, the oil was up for grabs and Harding gave it to the Interior Department to sell off rights to private oil barons. Now, the way that this was supposed to happen is that the oil companies were supposed to bid for the rights to the land, and the government was supposed to take the highest bidder, right? And the person in charge of this was the Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall. Now, Albert Fall and Ed Doheny were tight from way back in the 1880s before either of them had made a name for themselves. And they were a similar type of man, rugged, hardworking, sly, and willing to do whatever it took to get ahead. The two remained in touch as they both rose through the ranks, one in the private sector and one in the government. And when the time came to auction off the land, wouldn't you know it, Ed somehow knew exactly how much to bid for the most prosperous portion of the land available without having any competition or anybody else trying to get it. Now, it's not exactly clear how this scandal came out, but there are always whistleblowers around, and I salute them, honestly. Now, there was another oil baron who got his hands on a different part, and he was also part of this whole case, but I want to really focus on Ed because that's what the story's about. So in this case, the oil fields were awarded to their bidders in mid-1921, and by early 1922, scandal was already in the air and in the news. Fall and Doheny were under investigation by the government, Doheny for offering and Fall for accepting a bribe to the tune of $100,000 for insider information related to the purchase to the rights to drill at Elk Hills, which was the lot next door to Teapot Dome. Now, at first, President Harding backed Fall, saying he would never do such a thing. But as things became more and more clear, he distanced himself rather quickly and condemned Fall for all of his alleged actions. In return, Fall resigned, but that did not stop the fallout. Now, Doheny and another oil baron were put on trial for their activities, but it didn't even stop there. And also, they weren't put on trial for quite a long time. It's a really drawn-out thing. I think because these two men were so rich and powerful, they were able to sort of stave this off. So there's multiple proceedings and interviews and potential trials all through the 1920s. And it's a very entangled web, but essentially the government is building a case, trying the men, interviewing all of their, co-conspirators for about 9 years. No, about 7 years before this really comes to a head. Now, to clarify, when I say co-conspirators, I'm talking about Ned. You see, while Ed Sr. was the one to pony up the money for the bribe, it was his son, Ned, and Ned's faithful best friend and secretary, Hugh, who brought the money to Fall in Washington, D.C. In fact, investigators were able to track exactly what happened with the bribe, noting that Ned and Hugh traveled first to Ned's New York apartment, stayed a few days while visiting the bank to take out exactly $100,000 from Ned's bank account so that it wouldn't be as traceable, and then traveled to Washington, D.C. to the Waldman Park Hotel to hand deliver the money to Albert Fall. Now, because of this, Ned and Hugh were both very likely to be put on trial, and at a minimum, were called to the court multiple times to explain themselves. By 1924, it was clear that not only would Ed Sr. be indicted, but Ned also, and possibly still Hugh, though he was really only the driver and didn't seem to profit from this deal in any, direct way. I mean, these are his employers, so he probably, they make money, he makes money, but not, direct. Now, in 1926, Ned went on trial, but was somehow found not guilty, though he was still able to be charged again under similar crimes, which is exactly what happened in 1928, and this time, Hugh was also charged. Now, it seems that the reason that the prosecution was going after these men was to get them to roll over on Ed Sr., since he was clearly the mastermind of everything, but that's a really common prosecutorial kind of thing where they try to go after the lower guys to get them to roll over on the bigger guy, and if they don't, then at least they put those guys in prison, right? Now, of course, this was an extremely stressful time for the Doheny family, but it was probably even more so for Hugh, considering he wasn't really family, so the Dohenys could withdraw their support of him at any time. This was a very precarious situation for him to be in and for everyone else. Now, Albert Fall ended up being convicted in 1929 on bribery and conspiracy charges, but we'll circle back to that in a minute, because the way this all ends up feels very germane to our current political climate, let me tell you. Anyway, as I had noted previously, the mansion was being built while all of this was going on, which Ned and Hugh, like I said, were very involved with, and Hugh was going through a divorce. So lots of bad and stressful things happening in the Doheny world at this time, and everything was a bit, we'll just say, crazy. Now, as I mentioned, Albert Fall was convicted and sentenced in 1929 to 1 year in prison for his crimes, so very much a slap on the hand. That being said, something much more awful also happened in 1929 in the late hours of February 16th, when Hugh Plunkett came over unannounced to the Greystone Mansion, and he and Ned went into his room to discuss some serious business. This is at least what Lucy said. We may never know the true story or all of the details, but I'm giving you what I got. Now again, accounts of what happened next vary greatly, and the truth has never fully come to light, but what we can say is that around 2 a.m., Lucy and the family doctor, Dr. Ernest Clyde Fishbaugh, called the police to report 2 men dead at the house. When police arrived, they found 31-year-old Hugh on the ground, face down and spread eagle. He had been shot in the head and had fallen in a way that moved the rug beneath him. In his hand was a cigarette that burned all the way down and actually singed his hand. So, seems like he was shot unexpectedly. I'm just going to throw that in right now. That's just my personal assessment. And on the ground about 10 feet away was a second body, that of Ned Doheny. Ned was on his back with a clear bullet wound in his head, so both of them had head wounds. It had entered from the left, exited through the right temple, and lodged in the wall. A gun, the supposed murder weapon, was found, still very warm, under Hugh Plunkett's body, which was strange as the shots heard by Lucy had been fired over 3 hours earlier. Now, according to Lucy, Hugh had come over very distressed and locked himself away with Ned. While in another area of the house, she heard sounds coming from the room, but nothing too concerning. She then heard what sounded like a pop, and then initially, she said, followed a few minutes later by another pop. When she went into the room, she found 2 men on the floor. Now, instead of calling the police, she called the family doctor, who had been out watching a play, but came immediately to her aid, Dr. Fishbaugh. She also called Ed Doheny, who came as quickly as he could, Ed Doheny Sr., obviously, though was apparently gone before the police came, which is probably an intentional move on the part of the family, and probably also pretty smart. Now, the story in the papers the next day and for, weeks following was this: that Hugh, overwhelmed, distraught, and mentally unstable, killed first Ned and then himself to avoid the shame of having to testify in court or going to prison, which would have been the last straw for a divorced, sickly man like Hugh. Now, as you can imagine, this story was pushed by Ned's very rich and powerful family, and for many years was considered the real story. Hugh, unstable, killed Ned, then himself. However, even as immediately as that night, police saw another story unfolding altogether. They knew Lucy and the doctor were being dishonest about the situation, and they knew this because when they arrived, it was clear that the bodies had been moved, and both had a very rehearsed story to tell. But even that story changed over time. Now, first, the doctor said he had been at the home when the shots were fired. He said that Lucy had called him because Hugh was in such a state and she wanted his help. Now, this story was part of a larger narrative to paint Hugh as unstable, and the doctor was a big part of that, claiming he'd been treating Hugh for months for his anxiety. And that is why he was supposedly there when everything happened, even though initially Lucy said, oh, well, I heard, shots and called the doctor. Then they both sort of changed the story to be like, oh, well, I called the doctor because they were fighting, and then we both heard shots. And in fact, the doctor took this story a little bit farther by saying not only had he heard the first shot, but when he did, he went to the room where the noise had come from and saw Hugh standing outside. When Hugh saw him, he said, "Don't come in," then slammed the door, and a moment later, there was another pop. So obviously, they're making it sound like Hugh murdered Ned, saw the doctor, freaked out, and killed himself. And then, of course, when they entered the room, both men were dead. Now, that's what they said at first. Both men were dead. Now, during their very first interview with the doctor on the night of the murders, they already caught him in a lie. He at first, like I said, he said, both men were dead when we walked in. Neither body had been touched, but police knew they had, as the blood on Ned's face had spread across his nose, as though he had been laying one way, then moved another, before the blood had a chance to dry. So it showed that the blood had moved in 2 directions on his face. At this, when they told him, hey, doc, you're full of shit, he changed his story entirely to include a very large detail that Ned had in fact still been alive for about 20 minutes after he entered the room, and that the doctor had tried to help keep him alive. Which, at that point, wouldn't you have called for help, like an ambulance or something, to actually try to keep him alive? If you had a full 20 minutes of him struggling to live, you would try to call in the big guns, right? Pun intended. Anyway, again in the news, Hugh was the murderer, and even the coroner's report bolstered that argument, or at least what they released of it. They said that Hugh had placed the gun to his own head so hard that there were powder burns inside his skull, which had been fractured in 4 places due to the blast from the gun, because he was pushing it so hard against his head. They also confirmed that Ned had been shot from 6 feet away, and that he had not lived for 20 minutes, but only for a moment, which is convenient. They basically said, oh, the doctor wasn't totally lying when he said that, but he was probably, stressed out, and it seemed like a lot longer than it was, right? So everybody's telling the truth here. However, this narrative still didn't sit right with Hugh's family, nor the main investigator, Les White, who was on the scene the night of the murder-suicide. So let's get into why this is bullshit, shall we? I've left out some of the details of the crime scene because I want to use them here to explain why these people are full of shit, if that makes sense. Now, first, we have the bodies being moved. Why do that if there's nothing to hide, right? I mean, that's not even first. First, we have them waiting 3 hours to call. But that's kind of a given that that's ridiculous. Beyond that, why were the bodies moved? Second, again, why call the doctor and your family before you call the police? Also, like I said before, why not call for help if your husband is still alive? Also, upon further investigation, which of course this was not released to the public, it was found that in order for Hugh to have shot Ned and had the bullet lodge in the wall where it was found, he would have had to have been on his knees beneath Ned, which sounds highly implausible. Also, there were powder burns on Ned's head as well, meaning the gun was very near his head when the trigger was pulled, not 6 feet away. And the fact that the gun was that close to Hugh's head could have very easily meant someone else was pressing it against him. In fact, it almost makes more sense in my opinion, as it's not that easy to push something against your own temple that hard. Like, not as hard as someone with more leverage could do, Also, police immediately were like, this gun is way too hot to have been used 3 hours ago and then left under somebody's body. And in fact, when they did ballistics testing, which they did back then, believe it or not, they were unable to replicate the temperature of the gun when they found it 3 hours after the shooting. So they shot it fresh, and it was never as hot as it was when they found it supposedly 3 hours after it had been fired. So all of this sort of like at the scene evidence really points to what the narrative in the news and pushed by the family, the Doheny family, is kind of bullshit. There's also a finer point that I'm not really good at explaining, but essentially they also disproved what the doctor said about Ned being alive. I'm sorry, not Ned, about Hugh being alive and slamming the door in his face by looking at the placement of both the cigarette and the gun in his hand. And I realize it's again, I'm going to leave it because I'm not very good at explaining it, but essentially what they were saying is he wouldn't have been able to slam the door and then shoot himself as quickly as the doctor said because of the placement of the gun and his body and XYZ. So anyway, all of this shows on the scene that they were lying. Now beyond this, Ned, whose family, the Dohenys, were devout Catholics, was not buried in the family cemetery, which was on holy Catholic land, right? I'm an atheist, so I'm not sure what you call that, but it was in a Catholic cemetery. Now instead, he was buried in a Christian cemetery, in Glendale actually, and only about 50 yards from him, Hugh was buried. Now, why is this significant? Because in Catholicism, you cannot kill yourself, and if you do, you can't be buried in their cemetery, and you also won't go to heaven. So the fact that they did not bury him is in that, family plot is very suspicious. My assumption, and the assumption of many, is that his family probably told their priest the truth, and he forbade Ned from being buried in their cemetery. So all of this leads us to believe, and this is the prevailing theory now, that Ned first killed Hugh and then himself. Now, as to why he did it, that remains uncertain, but there are a few theories, and some of them can work in conjunction with one another. So, let's discuss. Now, first, there's the obvious. The men were being forced to testify in court, both against each other and also against Ned's father, who was facing, potentially a decent prison sentence if he was convicted, and is also a very powerful man. So, it's very, very scary. And obviously this can be scary for each man differently, but in the end, it was Ned's father whose reputation and freedom were at risk. And it was Ned himself who faced the harsher charges of the two, as he was seen as the bag man, having himself delivered the money while Hugh was just the driver. Now, beyond this, there were other signs pointing to Ned being the better bet for a murder-suicide for the perpetrator of such. Members of his family, mostly on the side by marriage, on like Lucy's side, claimed that Ned suffered from depression, which makes a lot of sense when you think about it. His mother died when he was young, and his father was away making his fortune, leaving Ned very much alone for most of his youth. This was probably very traumatizing and definitely made for a very lonely childhood. Even in his adulthood, there are photos of him. Before I really knew a lot about this case, I would look at photos of him and I was like, this man looks really not sad, just unhappy. It's not even like an emotion of the moment where he's just like particularly sad in that instance. Every photo of him, he just looks unhappy. Not to mention that his mother committed suicide over his father's leaving her, which doesn't necessarily mean anything, but it does point to the possibility that depression runs in their family. Now, a man named Anson Lisk Jr., whose uncle was called to the scene the night of the men's deaths, later said that it was a known fact that Ned lived in another part of the house away from Lucy. Anson is Lucy's nephew, so it was his father, Lucy's brother, who was called to the house. And so the family, it was kind of like an open secret that they were sort of living away from each other. And I mean, it's a big enough house to do it, right? Now, as for why, he said that this was due to his moods and his depression, which Lucy wanted to shelter the children from, which also kind of helps with this theory. But it also lends credibility to another theory, which I believe, if true, was a factor in this mess, but definitely not the whole reason. See, Anson also said, very matter-of-factly in an interview years after all of this, that Ned and his secretary were in a relationship. His secretary being Hugh. Now, this rumor has been around since the day of the deaths, but in his words and in his matter-of-fact way of talking, this was very much a known thing. Also, it makes sense that they would be lovers, because why else would Hugh spend nearly every night in their mansion, in the same half of the mansion where Ned also stayed, far away from Lucy and the children? Why would he let his marriage dissolve while spending all of his time with someone who is at most a friend and at worst simply his employer, right? And I'm not saying that marriages don't fall apart like this, where someone is away from the home because of work or whatever, but, where he was specifically and why he was there, it just makes me wonder. It also makes it a bit more understandable how tensions ran so high between the two men, and why Ned wasn't buried in the Catholic plot with the rest of his family, because, even if he was the victim, which nobody believes at this point, if he was in a gay relationship, that's another way to not get buried with the rest of the family, right? Now, there's a ton of other evidence pointing to this, but I think I've made my point here. And there's an argument that the whole gay storyline was more to besmirch the Doheny family name or for the sake of selling papers, once the Dohenys no longer kind of had a stranglehold on the papers, because while it was something people talked about back then, it wasn't really reported until later when it was safe to do so. But I do think it's worth mentioning because even, close friends of the family at that time mentioned that they were far more than just employer or employee. Though what that meant at the time, it's hard to say. Like people who are friends with Ed Sr. were like, oh yeah, those two men were way closer than just friends. And they never said what they meant by that, but it all kind of points to that. Now, in 1936, Les White, the detective on the case who was shut down by his boss, the media, and the Doheny family, and wasn't really allowed to investigate any of the things that he noticed that night or afterward, released a memoir about many high-profile cases he'd worked on in Los Angeles, definitely including the Greystone Mansion Murders. Now, it's hard to find a copy, and it was definitely hard back then, and especially in Los Angeles. And Hugh's brother went to try to buy one, and was told by many of the bookstores that he went to that the Doheny family bought every copy available, presumably to keep it out of the hands of their peers in the LA area. So, what happened may never truly be known, but I believe, and most people believe at this point, that Ned killed first Hugh and then himself. Now, as far as his motive, I think his main motive was to spare his father from prosecution for his crimes, as the family had sort of looked at different ways to avoid having Hugh testify, including having him check into a mental health clinic, which back then not super nice places. We would call them like sanitariums, to avoid having to testify. Now, as a note, this is where much of what the doctor said about Hugh came from. Basically, they spun the tale that Hugh had been mentally unwell for months, maybe even a year, due to infected teeth and the stress of his divorce and the scandal. This narrative was first created so that there would be a paper trail if he did in fact agree to go to the mental hospital as directed by the Doheny family. But it worked out well to use it to frame him for Ned's murder, when it was most likely, like I said, the other way around. And so I think when, Ned finally realized, like, Hugh's not going to cooperate, he's not going to do what we want, plus he's already depressed, plus he's very stressed out about what's going to happen with his father, he just decided we just both have to die. Now, whether or not there was a romantic element, I can't say, and I don't know that it matters. What does matter is clearing the name of a man who fell victim to a very wealthy and powerful family who would apparently do anything to keep their name clean in the media, which I hope I've helped to do. I hope that I've helped to clear Hugh's name. Now, as for what happened to good old Ed Doheny, well, unlike the other oil man to give Fall a bribe, Doheny walked entirely free, acquitted on all charges. And the other man who gave Albert Fall a bribe also did not go to prison for bribery or conspiracy. He went for contempt of, not contempt of court, but something similar to that, which is really interesting because Albert Fall was found guilty of accepting bribes, but nobody was found guilty of bribing him, which is a very interesting thing. And it maybe not so much interesting as telling of the way that power and powerful men work in our society, I would say to this day. So Ed escaped, and all it took was the life of his son and his son's best friend. Was it a price worth paying? I don't really know. What I do know is it shows a strong pattern that is still alive and well in our country. If you're rich, you can get away with anything, including murder. You can buy the newspapers and tell them what to print. You can bribe the government to give you all the means to make money while others go without. And as for Greystone, it now belongs to the city of Beverly Hills and sits on, I think, only about 20 acres of land. The rest has been given to the city or sold off, and some of it actually is the home of the city's water supply, which is pretty crazy. The house itself hosts children's summer camps. They do tours of the interior of the home, and as I mentioned, private events like weddings, which I help to cater. And that's about it. That's the history of Teapot Dome, of Doheny, the Doheny family, and the Greystone murder-suicide, as committed by Ned against Hugh Plunkett, and covered up by the family. All right, there it is. Guys, I started recording this in mid-January. It's February 1st, and I'm finally posting this. I'm so sorry it took so long. That is a testament to how much work I've been doing and how sick I've been. Again, I swear to God, I feel like I'm always telling you guys I'm sick, but with a 10-year-old, I am always sick. And if any of you have kids, you know it because you're always sick too. It makes it hard to record because I sound like a psycho and I'm voice is all crackly and awful, or I'm sniffling. It's terrible. So I'm trying to avoid that as much as possible. But it makes things take a little longer. So I apologize, and I thank you all for your patience with these. And I thank you all for listening and supporting. And I hope this has been a great story for you, despite, the murder elements. Please rate, review, tell all your friends. And until next time, stay safe.